All right, sorry about that. I got it going.
Thank you. The January 19th, 2022 special meeting of the West Hartford Plan and Zoning Commission and duly designated Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Agency is called to order. My name is Kevin Ahern, Chair of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual meeting. For the record, I'd like to note that the required meeting agenda and application materials are all available on the town website. This meeting is being conducted in a virtual format in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act, as amended by Public Act 21-2, which authorizes municipalities to conduct public meetings virtually. Will the town planner please call the roll?
Commissioner Gillette. Commissioner Prestidge.
Here.
Commissioner Gomes.
Here.
Commissioner Binkhurst.
Here.
Mr. Chairman Ahern.
Present. Thank you.
And for the record, I would like to note that Brian Pudlick, Associate Planner, myself, Town Planner, are in attendance, and also on the screens, we have a nearly full contingent of staff from the Engineering Division, starting with Mr. Martin, Greg Summer, Jim Brennan, Julie Vieira, and Jason McCabe. Would I also like to welcome you all to. He's the newest engineer that's hired within the town. So you will see from time to time going forward technical review comments from Mr. McCabe on many applications that get referred out. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to hand the baton over to Mr. Martin. He is going to introduce our guest speaker tonight. By way of background, I just wanted to remind the committee, this is our continued discussion regarding stormwater. We began that discussion and training back in December, and we had a presentation by folks from NEMO on issues related to stormwater and land use, and we started to touch upon LID practices and MS4 controls and regulations. So working with the Planning Commission, we all want to continue that discussion. Tonight, we're going to hear a presentation more about what the town has been doing around stormwater, really around our MS4 program. So you're going to hear about that in greater detail. And then hopefully that will provide us at the end with your guidance, some direction and segue into how staff can start to look at changes to our regulatory ordinances to make them more LID supportive. If any commissioners have comments, I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin. And Mr. Martin, feel free, mic is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais, members of TP&Z, Inland Wetlands, and others in attendance. My name is Dwayne Martin. I'm the Acting Director of Community Development and Town Engineer. Just want to comment quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to our presentation. So my former job at the town of Windsor, I was tasked with working on, back then it was the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection's stormwater or MS4 permit. So that was my introduction back in 2004 to that permit, which was very complex, confusing at times, and for some communities onerous to comply. That permit was issued for approximately 5 years, and then some time went by where the permit sort of stalled, and then now the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection came out with a newer permit back in 2017, which was even more complicated and involved. So there was a bit of a learning curve for most communities to adapt to that. I believe the town of West Hartford has done a really good job working on this permit through the years. We have information posted on our webpage with the permit and the plan and our annual reports. I started as a town engineer. I started doing the annual reports for the first 2 years of the newer permit, so 2017 and 2018, and realized that as the permit would continue on, it became more and more complicated, and we needed assistance. So the town reached out for a consultant to assist in our MS4 efforts, and CDM Smith came to our rescue. And I compliment them all the time on their great work, and this would have been a challenge for town staff to handle on its own, as you'll understand when the presentation continues. I do want to point out that my effort is not alone in supporting the staff assisting CDM Smith on this. Julie Vieira, civil engineer in our office, plays a great role on this, and she's also involved in our LID discussion. So if she would like to comment tonight, she's welcome to do so. So there are two members from CDM Smith here tonight, Cindy Baumann and Emily Mccarron. Cindy is going to do the presentation tonight. She has a PowerPoint to run through. I just want to do a quick introduction. If you're not familiar with Cindy, she has over 30 years of engineering experience. She is a licensed professional engineer, and her experience is focused on stormwater evaluation, design, and permitting. For the last 15 years, she has been assisting Connecticut municipalities with stormwater requirements and has been working with West Hartford for the past 5 years, as I mentioned, assisting with both stormwater capacity studies and our MS4 permit requirements. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Cindy to continue on with the presentation. Take it away, Cindy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. So I will start with sharing my presentation, and let me share. Pimp down. And so I will be presenting, as Dwayne had mentioned, as well as Todd, that I will be presenting on the municipal separate storm sewer system, which is called the MS4 permit requirements, which are part of the Connecticut DEP permitting requirements. And so I am going to go over just kind of a background on stormwater pollution, and then I'm going to go over the municipal separate storm sewer system permit. And as part of that permit, there are 6 minimum control measures, which I will then go in a little more detail in those. And then I will wrap up as to what the town planning and zoning and the IWWA can do to assist with this permit and to comply with the permit. And then what I will also do is at the end of each of my group of slides, I will take a pause so that you guys can have comments at that time, but you can also at the end, we're going to have comments and questions. So just an overview of stormwater pollution. And so this, I think many of you probably have seen a similar slide where we compare the natural environment to the development. And so the natural environment has very little runoff, about 10%, a lot of infiltration, and then also evapotranspiration. But yet, once we develop it, then we have a lot more runoff. As you can see, there's 55% compared to like a 10%. And then there's also less infiltration. And so the key here is like the increase in the runoff with development and the decrease in the infiltration. So as I go through, a lot of the stormwater BMPs want to try to infiltrate to improve water quality and also reduce runoff. So stormwater pollution, the MS4 permit is focused majority on pollution. So it's more of the low flows. It does not really affect or regulate more capacity or high flows or flooding. So its focus is on stormwater pollution. And stormwater can pick up a variety of pollutants, whether it's sand and salt from roadways, construction from sediment on construction sites, and then also fertilizers and pesticides. And then there's also animal waste. There's also oil and grease, which is the middle photo, and then just litter. And all these stormwater pollutants end up getting into your collection system and then discharging to your nearby water bodies. And majority of the time, and this is based just on industry standard over the years, there's very little or no treatment of these stormwater runoffs and these pollutants, and they discharge directly to your water bodies. One focus in the MS4 permit is with respect to municipal operations, and municipal operations have a big impact on your stormwater quality. And so I do have a list here of the different municipal operations that can have an impact, and most of them, if you do them, will actually have a positive impact. So there's street sweeping, where you can then collect the sediment from the pavement prior to entering the drainage system. There's catch basin inspections and cleanings, which do the same thing. They collect litter and pollutants from entering the stormwater system. And then there's also just general drainage and street repair, which prevents pollutants from entering. There's outfall inspections, which I will kind of go in more detail as part of the MS4 permit requirements. And then there's municipal facility management. So this is management of your wastewater treatment plants, your DPW facilities, your parks, and that can have a positive impact on your stormwater quality. And then the municipal construction projects and implementation of your sedimentation and erosion control measures. And then just your park maintenance. And then also maintenance of any other stormwater BMPs, whether you have like a water quality chamber or detention ponds, those are your other stormwater BMPs. And then just training employees. And this is maybe the third or fourth training that I've done with Dwayne and with various town employees. And it is part of the MS4 permit is to do municipal training on stormwater. So some of the municipal hot spots are public work yards, your vehicle and equipment storage locations, any maintenance yards, and as I mentioned before, the water and wastewater treatment facilities. And then any of your public, whether it's your buildings, your parks, your golf courses, your swimming pools, your splash pads, any of those municipal facilities are potential hotspots. And the hotspots can produce high levels of a variety of stormwater pollutants. And also they have a higher risk for illicit discharges, which I'll explain and go into a little more detail later, and then also spills. So that is kind of just an overview of stormwater pollution, and I'll just take a pause to see if there are any questions.
I have an idiot question. What does BMP stand for?
Well, I should, yes, it is a best management practice. And so
Okay.
Yep, so those are the stormwater best management practices. They can be like a rain garden, or they can be, it can also just be like street sweeping or catch basin cleaning, any type of practice that improves water quality.
I just didn't understand the acronym. Okay, thank you.
Liz, in your defense, I have all the acronyms here. I had to actually write a cheat sheet for myself, so you're not alone.
Okay, then I will move forward and I will make sure that I explain the acronyms, which I was trying to make sure I do that at the beginning of this presentation, but I'm going to move forward now with the municipal separate storm sewer system. So there's the M and then the 4 S's. That's the MS4 permit, and it's the Connecticut DEP permit. They have the Connecticut DEP has issued both the guidelines for erosion and sedimentation control in 2002, and they have also issued the small MS4 permit. And Dwayne kind of mentioned this, where he had started in the 2003-2004 timeframe on this small MS4 permit. And then in the same time frame, they also, Connecticut DEP, issued the stormwater quality manual. And then in 2011, they actually had an appendix to that manual that included your low impact development practices. And I am going to go into more detail of that, both the erosion and sedimentation control guideline, as well as the stormwater quality manual. And then as Dwayne had mentioned, in 2017, the Connecticut DEP issued the update to the small MS4 permit. And that was effective in July of 2017, and it is a 5-year permit. And I do have at the bottom here shown that under minimum control measure 6, which I will describe a little later, one of the requirements is this employee training, where you're required to do formal training of your employees to increase your awareness of water quality and also increase your awareness of the MS4 permit requirements. And so this presentation tonight actually fulfills one of your MS4 permit requirements. So this is a list from the Connecticut DEP of the 6 minimum control measures, and that's the MCM. I'm not going to use that anymore, but that's used a lot throughout the permit, is the minimum control measures. And then they actually have a 7th minimum control measure as well. And so the first is public education and outreach. Second is public involvement and participation. And the third is illicit discharge detection and elimination, which I will go in a little more detail because that one does have a lot of requirements and also is a little more technical that you may not be aware of some of the requirements. And then minimum control measure 4 is your construction site stormwater runoff control, which is your soil erosion and sedimentation control requirements. And then minimum control measure 5 is your post-construction stormwater management. And I will go in a little more detail on that as well. And that's the one that includes your low impact development requirements. And then minimum control measure 6 is pollution prevention and good housekeeping. And then the last one is wet weather monitoring. So that's just an overview of the permit. So we'll just take a pause to see if you have any questions or comments on just the overall permit before I go into each minimum control measure.
I just have a quick, what is the threshold between a small and something that's not a small?
Well, the
Does that even
smallest,
concern us? Do I even need to worry about this?
yeah, well, the small MS4 permit, there's only one non-small, like there's not a medium really. So the city of Stamford or city of Stamford city is the only large MS4 that has an individual permit. And then all of the other municipalities, unless you're really small, but I want to say like 90% of the municipalities in Connecticut are a small MS4. So you really won't be the large MS4 unless you're a large like Stamford. And the other thing to remember, this is your MS4, which is your separate storm sewer system. So anyone that has a combined system does not fall under this permit. So even though Hartford is large, they do not fall under this permit because they are not a separated storm sewer system. If they have pieces of their community that are separated, then those particular areas would fall under this permit. But a lot of the ones that are that have combined systems, they don't fall under this permit. So you really only have large and small. So.
And I just wanted to add a quick follow-up, and I think I understand this, but I want to make sure I do going forward. So what was approved in 2017 was the town of West Hartford's permit, which expires at the end of June. Is that? Am I reading
Correct.
that? Okay,
Yes.
just want to make sure. Yeah,
And
that's.
any municipality that was under the 2004 permit as a small MS4 also was under the 2017 permit. The 2017 did include some additional municipalities in Connecticut that were added because they either had a population growth or an increase in their urbanized area. It's all based on your urbanized area. So.
And Cindy, if I could just jump in there, that designation is critical to being designated as an MS4 community. And it's based on census designation of urbanized area or even a portion of your community that has an urbanized area. And the big change from the prior set of permits into the 2017 one was that any growth or other areas that qualified under that update that definition and basically threw in a number of more rural or suburban communities into the MS4 permitting requirements. So if we were to look at a map of Connecticut, for example, essentially with the exception of the northwest hill towns and some of the northeast hill towns and then extending down into Middlesex County, pretty much the whole state is now an MS4 community.
And there is a map that shows those urbanized area, and it does reflect what, I don't know who was speaking, but was it Todd or Dwayne? I don't know.
Go ahead, Cindy. I'm sorry to interrupt. That was Todd. I won't do it again.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Okay, so I'm going to go through the 6 minimum control measures, and I'll start with the public education and outreach. So the public education and outreach, for each minimum control measure, you had to come up with, now this is a different type of a BMP, but this is kind of the Connecticut DEP permit requires you to develop these best management practices, which are more of a goal or a something that you put in your stormwater management plan of what you as the municipality are going to do as part of this MS4 permit. And so for each minimum control measure, in the 2017-2018 timeframe, the town of West Hartford developed a stormwater management plan that included a list of each BMP under each minimum control measure, and it was what the town said they would do over the next 5 years to address this MS4 permit. So under public education and outreach, you had 2 BMPs that you identified in that stormwater management plan. One was to implement a public education program, and the second one was to address public education and outreach in their areas where there's pollutants of concern. And so you did develop a program and you've implemented the program, and you're supposed to be evaluating the effectiveness of that public program, and then you tailor your program based on the effectiveness. And so I do have some examples. So as part of this public education and outreach, it was, I believe, like the 2019 timeframe that you developed the stormwater brochure. It is a 2-sided brochure that includes, it's geared more towards residences, so it does include recommendations for residential property owners on how to help improve pollutants or improve your discharge from stormwater to reduce pollutants. And the other thing that you've done is you've marked your catch basins. So majority of your catch basins around town have this drain to water course stamp on top of them so that people know that the water that goes in there drains to a water course. It does not go to the sewer. And then there's a lot of other public education and outreach items that you do have on your stormwater website. And I did include the link there for the stormwater website. And so you could go on and you could look at what type of public education and outreach measures have been implemented as part of the stormwater MS4 permit. So then I've got minimum control measure 2, which is public participation. And so there were 2 BMPs under this as well, 2-1 and 2-2. Which are comply with public notice requirements and then continue stormwater committee meetings. One of the compliance under 2.1 is that you are to put your stormwater management plan on your website, and that was done in the 2018 timeframe when that was finalized. And then also annually, you do have to put your annual reports, and Dwayne has been very good at putting the annual reports on your website as required under this permit. And then also you're supposed to put them on in February for public notice and then finalize them in April. And he has been doing that over the last 5 years to get public input on your annual reports. The next minimum control measure is illicit discharge detection and elimination. And this is the one that actually has a lot of BMP requirements. And it also is the one I think that majority of the municipalities I work with, they have to put the largest amount of effort and the largest amount of dollars and funding to this minimum control measure. So this minimum control measure includes 8 BMPs. You have to develop a written IDD program. So that's your illicit discharge detection and elimination. And I do have a definition of that in a little bit. So I will go into that in a little more detail. You also have to develop outfall mapping. So you have to map and locate all of your outfalls in the GIS. Develop a citizens reporting program for illicit connections. Establish legal authority over the illegal connections. And develop a record keeping connections, and develop a record keeping, and then address IDDs in areas where there's pollutants of concern. And then there's also a dry weather screening of your outfalls, and then a sanitary sewer overflows inventory. And I'm going to kind of focus on both BMPs 3.1 and then also 3.6, 7, and 8. So an illicit discharge is any discharge to your stormwater municipal separate storm sewer system that does not include entirely stormwater. And so it has to be something other than stormwater that's connected to those drainage pipes. And they do have in the Connecticut DEP permit, they do have a list of exceptions, and I have listed them here. And as long as those exceptions are identified and documented in your stormwater management plan, then they are considered exempt from the IDDE program. And as you can see, it's uncontaminated groundwater irrigation. There's also firefighting activities, and then any street wash water from your street sweeping, and then just naturally occurring discharges. And so the IDD program requires you
question,
to
Cynthia?
develop. Yep.
So again, just back to that previous slide. So it says uncontaminated groundwater. So if there's a construction site and they have to do some dewatering, where can they put that water and still the town still stays compliant?
If they have a construction site with if they're like pumping out an area or that kind of stuff, then they have to actually put it through a type of sedimentation removal. A lot of times it might be a like a tank that can then remove the sediment, or it can be like a sandbag depression. There's a lot of sedimentation and erosion control measures that they can then put that water through, and then it can be discharged to the river, the drainage system, wherever it normally went today.
As long as it's treated, okay, and it meets the standard for the state. Fantastic, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so the IDD program was developed in 2018, and so the Connecticut DE permit has a lot of IDDE requirements. There's a lot in the permit and a lot in the appendices. And so as part of this IDD plan that was developed in 2018, there were requirements included in this plan to address your dry weather outfall sampling, wet weather outfall sampling, notifications to residents and employees, drainage system investigations, and then the removal of the illicit connections. And so I'm going to kind of go over some of these. I'm going to go over the dry weather, the wet weather, and then the drainage system investigations. So your outfall screening, you have 418 outfalls in the town of West Hartford. And we went out, CDM Smith went out, and we did dry weather inspections of all of your outfalls. And so we went out when there was a dry weather day. And so there are permit requirements with respect to antecedent conditions and when the last rainfall was to document that you went out during dry weather. And we would go out with an iPad and we would document the condition at each outfall. And if there was flow during dry weather, we would sample that flow. And there are a list of parameters within the permit that we would check to see if there were exceedances for any pollutants of concern. And so then based on that information, we then developed investigations upstream in the systems. So we prioritize the outfalls based on the permit. There's permit requirements with respect to how to prioritize, in addition to the results from the dry weather sampling. And so we would take the outfalls with the highest priority, and we would work up the system going from manhole to catch basins to manholes, and we would sample. If there is flow, we would sample for temperature, pH, and conductivity using a meter. And then we would also do ammonia, surfactants, and chlorine with test kits. And if we had some exceedances, we would follow it up in the system and kind of find out or try to identify where this exceedance is coming from. And so typically what would happen is we would identify a manhole where we had exceedances and we go to the next upstream manhole and it would be dry, or there would be flow that didn't have the exceedance in it. So then we would know that something is happening between the two manholes. And so then we would recommend to the town to do CCTV inspection. So that's closed circuit TV inspection of the pipe, to see if we could figure out if there was a particular resident or a particular business that was tying in somewhere between those manholes, or if there was some kind of crack in the drainage pipe that maybe, you know, there was also a crack in the sewer and the two were somehow hydraulically connected. So we then did CCTV inspection of those select reaches between manholes. And then based on that, if we did see a connection that was tying into that drain line, then we would identify the homes or the residences or the businesses that would be in that general direction of where that connection was, and then we would dye test. So we would go in the buildings and we would put dye in the sewer, in a sink in the basement, you know, in a toilet, any type of any type of thing within the building that would exit the building, typically through the sewer. And then we would have someone outside that would be looking in both the drain manhole and the sewer manhole to confirm conductivity of that particular toilet or sink or dishwasher or something like that. And the picture to the bottom right is one where we did see the dye in the manhole, and then we got confirmation. So once we get the confirmation, then we know that that particular building is connected, and then we have to work with the property owner to disconnect that building from the drainage system. And this IDD investigations as part of the MS4 permit will continue for a while. It is currently being done in the priority that is part of the permit, and I think the town of West Hartford is actually doing very well compared to other municipalities with respect to this IDD investigations. But this is a big effort, and it will be ongoing after the permit term ends. So, and just generally, so you know, once the permit does end, Connecticut DEP requires you to still do those permit requirements, even though the permit term has ended.
Cindy, quick question about that. So please don't name names, but just generalization. Is this, when you do find folks that are connected, is it more of a residential thing, a commercial thing, or an industrial thing?
I think in the town of West Hartford, I think probably it's more of a commercial or industrial, but it can be anything. I mean, in Connecticut, it's all over the gamut. Because you can have, and I have found where people put additions on and your contractor decides to just go to the closest structure, and it happens to be the drainage system.
Yeah.
But then I also find a lot of old industrial connections where the industry didn't even know they were connected. So it can be a wide range.
Okay, thank you.
So the last minimum control measure, which was BMP 3.8, is with respect to sanitary sewer overflows. So this sanitary sewer overflow is also an illicit discharge. And so a sanitary sewer overflow is when untreated sanitary wastewater from your sewer system actually discharges out of the system. And so I do have some photos of a sanitary sewer overflow. And it's usually caused by either like a blockage in the sewer, so the like the downstream pipe is blocked and it has to come out the manhole, or it can also be during when I&I, which is your infiltration and inflow. So during rainfall, when the sewer system is actually taking in some of that rainfall runoff, or it's taking in groundwater and infiltration, and it does not have the capacity to convey the sewer and the infiltration and inflow, and so you have a sanitary sewer overflow. And then you can also have a malfunctioning downstream pump station or a broken sewer line. So it's important to just identify these, and as part of the MS4 permit, you have to track and document them. And there's also reporting requirements to Connecticut DEP with respect to sanitary sewer overflows. So that is, this is the end. This is the last slide of the IDDE, where I wanted to kind of just give you some examples of where, you know, you may see an illicit connection and you should really report it to Dwayne in the engineering so that they can document it and potentially remove that illicit connection. So an uncovered dumpster that actually lets the water flow out of the dumpster and into the drainage system is an illicit connection because it's pollutants and entering your storm sewer system. Also, if you happen to see suds or detergents in a catch basin, that is not where the suds should be, so you should just report that as well. If someone like a resident complains of a sewage smell in a nearby stream, that's a potential illicit connection. or illicit discharge. And then if you see any discolorization of a stream, especially in industrial areas, then that is typically an illicit discharge from an industrial facility. So all 4 of these examples are ones that if you see it and you're out and about, or you get a resident that sees it and tells you about it, it is an illicit potential connection, and it should be documented and followed up. So that is the end of the IDDE, and I will pause here because I know this is a big program and a big component of the MS4 permit. So I'll see if anyone has any questions.
Liz.
I'm I'm just curious. I know I'm not asking for a final list or an exhaustive. Do we have a lot of problems in West Hartford when you've done the checking of the outflow? I mean, are we?
Compared to other municipalities, you do not.
Okay. Okay.
And I think it has a lot to do with you don't have as many older systems, because I do see the older the municipality, the more, and not necessarily just older, but older and industrial. So, and I also think though that West Hartford is proactive. And so I don't know what you've done in the past, but I think you've had a positive impact in the past. And so you don't have the illicit connections compared to a lot of the other municipalities I work with.
Okay, I just did all those terrible pictures. I just wonder if we've got suds in all our sewers or not.
That suds picture is actually from Hartford.
Of course it is. Thank you.
Yep.
Cindy,
Thank you.
if I can just ask, or rather just add a little bit of additional information. If you go back to the slide on the sewer overflow.
On the sewer, this one? Yep.
Yeah, that one right there. Thank you. So Dwayne Martin, I just wanted to comment. We do have 3 structured sanitary sewer overflows in West Hartford, unfortunately. They've been there for a long time. I think pretty much everybody's aware of the NBC's tunnel project. That's going to get rid of those 3 structured sanitary overflows. So that project is underway. They're making a lot of good progress, but it's going to take probably a couple more years before they finish. But the idea is, rather than having the sewer, when it gets over capacity, discharge openly into a water course, it will drop down into the tunnel and then stay in the tunnel until they can pump it out to treat it. We had a really wet year last year, and there were a lot of sewer overflow occurrences. So this is a big problem that will get addressed by that project. So I just wanted to point that out.
Dwayne, that is something that is being taken care of currently. It may not be finished tomorrow, but we're on top of that.
Correct. And part of the reason I wanted to bring that up is you'll see that in the annual report. If you take a look at it, we are responsible for reporting when we have sanitary sewer overflows. And so depending on the year and how the sewer performs, there could be a lot of sewer overflow discharges. And yes, the tunnel will address those when it's done, and they're working on it. It's just a big project, so it's going to take a little bit longer to get there. But those should be eliminated once the tunnel is complete.
I should just note, this is a little more free form. To the extent that you have it already, the member should just jump in without even raising your hands. Thank you, Cindy. Proceed.
Okay. So I'm going to go over the minimum control measure 4 now, which is construction site runoff control, which is with respect to your sedimentation and erosion control measures.
So Cindy, this is Todd. Before you kind of go in through these BMPs, this in this area in particular, I think has the most relationship to the role of TPZ and IWWA, and I think it's important to understand where you are in the broader context of this larger permit. And I hope that Cindy's going to say surprise, because they're not pretty pictures, but when you go through an approval process, you will see that we do reactive and proactive enforcement of the approvals that you grant to different land uses, and you'll see that she goes through the slides here. This part in particular has a direct relationship to the work you do for the community. Go ahead, Cindy.
Yep. Thank you. And so this minimum control measure for site runoff control from construction, it has 5 BMPs. And so it's implementation and enforcement of land use regulations. It's development and implementation of interdepartmental coordination, and then review of site plans for stormwater quality, and then conduct site inspections for your sedimentation and erosion control requirements, and then implement procedures for public comments. So I will go over 3 of these BMPs in a little more detail. So with respect to BMP 4.1, which is implementation and enforcement of the regulations, the West Hartford Town's zoning ordinance establishes legal authority for erosion and sedimentation control under Article 8. And then also the zoning ordinance outlines drainage requirements within the floodplains and within open space under sections 177-8 and 177-13 respectively. And then the Connecticut DEP has guidelines for erosion and sedimentation control. And this is the 2002 manual that was released to give guidance on soil erosion and sedimentation control requirements. And I just want to touch on 2 main pieces of this document. And the first is the Chapter 5 details. And so in Chapter 5, there have a lot of details with respect to different sedimentation and erosion control guidelines. And so I did pull out an example here of just like a silt fence, where it does give you details, gives you requirements, gives you recommendations. And it is a good resource for both, contractors if they want to use these details, or also for you guys when you're in the field doing your inspections and you want to refer to a document that, that if the contractor is doing it wrong, you can refer to these details to support what you want required from the contractor. And then the other thing is just Appendix A of this manual also has model ordinances and some model ordinance language to include with respect to sedimentation, erosion, and control within your ordinance. So I do have, I did a little background with, mostly with Todd, and he provided some information because you guys do really well with inspection reports. And I do have an example here of one that's a recent report that you guys went out in response to a complaint. And so you are doing the soil erosion and sedimentation control inspections. And then I also have an example of one where a contract is submitted, because you are required as part of the MS4 permit for annual submittal of sedimentation and erosion control reports from contractors. And so this is an example of one that was submitted by Inocon Construction Management, and they provided a second page as well that has very good photos of what they are doing on that construction site.
So Cindy, if I could just quickly add on, these often come as your conditions of approval and your wetland authority or special use authority, or in the instance on the right side of the screen here, council's STD conditional approval. But it's to perform weekly or bi-weekly S&E control inspection reports or after significant rainfall events. So we do get the reports, we read them, follow up accordingly, and then there are action items for correction or items to address. The item on the end, on the other side, that's an IWW approval. And Cindy, if you could just touch upon, there's actually a threshold trigger, if I'm not mistaken, of a certain acreage in which these are required. If it falls under, they're not required. Is that accurate?
It's a 1 acre, yeah.
So that being said, a lot of our inspection reports and sites are under 1 acre, but we still do the same reporting and inspection requirements regardless of their size, because they can still have a negative impact in terms of offsite erosion. The example on the left, that property, I believe, was 1 acre and wouldn't have been triggered under the normal requirements, but we still apply them. And that's a great credit to both Brian Pudlick, Associate Planner, and our zoning enforcement staff. So they do stay on top of these, and we apply them at all scales, even those that aren't required by the MS4 permit.
And that is typical with most municipalities, that they apply it to all construction, and they don't really require that 1 acre or above. So. And just with respect to construction and illicit discharges, these discharges from construction sites are considered illicit discharges under the MS4 permit. And so when they do have soil erosion and sedimentation control measures that are not performing correctly, you do get the heavy sediment and the turbidity and the discharge of runoff from the site that's not just stormwater. So when you do see a brown or cloudy water coming off of a construction site, that is an illicit discharge, and it is caused by the improper sedimentation and erosion control measures. So that is minimum control measure 4. And I'll just pause for a minute just in case there's other questions, because that is a big TP&Z and IWWA do play a big role in minimum control measure 4, as well as the one coming up, minimum control measure 5. Okay, so we'll move on then to minimum control measure 5, which is your post-construction stormwater management. And this minimum control measure has 5 BMPs as part of your stormwater management plan. So the first one is establish low impact development authority, and then enforce that low impact development requirements. Implement your long-term maintenance plans, and then directly connected impervious area mapping. And I will go into more detail because I know the DCIA, or the directly connected impervious area, is probably unknown, or you probably don't really know what that entails. And then the last BMP was just post-construction in areas with pollutants of concern. So with respect to establishing low impact development authority and then enforcing this low impact development, a review of your regs resulted in the 3 comments I have below. So the town subdivision regulations require review of subdivision drainage system plans. And then the town's plan of conservation and development provides guidance on what should be included in the stormwater management plan. And then this does include the implementation of those best management practices and also low impact development. We do make a recommendation that the town zoning ordinance should be modified to include legal authority for new and redevelopment, and to utilize the 2004 Connecticut Stormwater Quality Manual, including the updates. And the updates do incorporate a lot of this low impact development recommendations and requirements. So the 2004 Connecticut DEP Stormwater Quality Manual included a lot of stormwater requirements, and it also then started to include low impact development requirements as well in the amendment in 2011. And I just wanted to kind of touch on just 4 different parts of this manual. It's a very good manual to use. Instead of every municipality creating their own stormwater requirements, you can incorporate the language that a developer has to meet the 2004 Connecticut Stormwater Quality Manual. And then you don't have to be the one who's developing all the requirements. And most of the Connecticut municipalities are doing this. They're referring in their ordinances to this Connecticut Stormwater Quality Manual, including appendices or amendments, I mean. So in Chapter 7, there's quite a bit of design criteria. So I included just a table from Chapter 7, and I know you can't really read it very well, but it gives you the sizing criteria for stormwater treatment practices. And so it prescribes exactly what like size it should be to treat your water quality volume, size it should be to prevent downstream erosion of your streams, the size to meet your different storms, and also sizing of like emergency overflows and that kind of stuff. So Chapter 7 has a lot of very good design criteria requirements for site development. And then Chapter 11 has examples for your stormwater BMPs, your best management practices. And I just pulled out this one, which was a stormwater pond. And what I really like, it does have a lot of detail, a lot of guidance on designing a stormwater pond. But the one thing I wanted to kind of show you is just this little table that has the boxes that are white, gray, or like a dark blue. And so it does show you for certain pollutants of concern how this particular stormwater BMP addresses those. And so if this stormwater BMP is being put in an area where you have an impaired water for a certain pollutant, then you can ask them, the developer, to use stormwater BMPs to address that pollutant of concern. So like this one, I know you can't, it's hard to read, but the first 3 boxes are sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen, and they all have a dark square, which means the stormwater pond does very well with addressing those 3 pollutants of concern. And then if you move down to like the white one, that's where it says groundwater recharge. So if you wanted to do groundwater recharge, this would not be a BMP that you would want to select. You'd want to go through the different BMPs in this chapter 11 and pick ones that address what your goal is for these stormwater BMPs.
Can I jump in with a question here?
Mhm.
So this is fascinating. I know Dwayne and his team lead up, my assumption is they're leading up the review of the post-construction stormwater design and any plan that's presented to the town. That said, so it looks like there's, for lack of better terms, a menu of options and devices that you can use, right? And like anybody else, I'm imagining that, a developer's, thinking about money, right? How can they get the most bang for their buck, return on investment. I get it. That said, with regards to the regulatory requirements to satisfy, application of these, the 2004 Stormwater Quality Manual, what does a developer have to do? Do they have to, what's the minimum threshold that they have to obtain?
So under chapter 7, they do have requirements for like your pre and post. So you have to meet your pre-existing flows, and your post flows have to meet your pre-flows. So that would be more of a stormwater quantity requirement. There's also a stormwater quality requirement where you have to treat the first flush. Then there's also a water quality volume requirement. And then there's also like a downstream, if you're discharging from your site, there's like downstream velocity requirements so that you don't create downstream erosion of your receiving, whether it's a receiving ditch or brook or a stream. So there's particular design criteria that they have to meet. And it's not anything out of the ordinary. It's kind of industry standard. So it's not like you're putting a burden on them. The other thing the manual does include, though, is it also includes language with respect to redevelopment. And most municipalities are seeing a lot more redevelopment than development. And redevelopment is more based on whether that developer, I'm forgetting the terminology now, but it's pretty much if they can meet the requirement and it's not a burden. So it really can't just be financial. It has to be more of when they redevelopment, maybe they lose a lot of property, or they can't have the same type of square footage or that kind of thing. And you have to prove that. So there's more leeway with redevelopment than with development.
So just one follow-up question on that. On redevelopment, do they need to meet the, for lack of better terms, the water quality, stormwater, off flow of the current developed site, in their redeveloped, or do they have to go and meet the requirements of the conditions as if there was no development there originally?
So yeah, so the
grandfathered in,
yeah, the redevelopment, they usually will get a waiver, or they will not have to meet the pre and post because their pre is already developed. I mean, they will meet the pre and post, but like you had said, their pre is already developed. So they won't create more flow coming off of their site. But majority of the time with respect to water quality, I mean, those are your smaller BMPs. Those are your little rain gardens, or your, little subsurface storage or something like that to provide infiltration. Those are easier to meet because it's based on a water quality volume, not your big storm volume. And so typically you do not get a waiver on a redevelopment for your water quality volume. So with redevelopments, you tend to see more of these small BMPs and not so much your pre and post big ponds or big storage facilities.
Go ahead,
So-
Todd.
What I was going to say, Kevin's line of questioning is very pertinent because I think a lot of the sites, for the most part, a handful of few, are redevelopment sites. And what we're talking about here is application of 2004 manual. Perhaps Mr. Martin or even Julie Vieira could explain that we basically hold each site, even a redevelopment, to a certain standard so that we're not increasing the level from a starting point. So it might not be reverting back to a green site or an undeveloped location, but it's not getting incrementally worse. We're trying to improve the situation on an incremental basis. So that's how we've handled redevelopments. Again, maybe not exactly as this guide design manual says, but I don't know if Dwayne or Julie want to comment further on that.
Hey, Todd, it's Dwayne. If Julie's there, she would be good to comment. She has been handling the bulk of these reviews, but I'm not sure if she's able to.
I'll just, while we're waiting for Joe, I'll jump in and say I've been kind of frustrated by some projects, large and small, that have said we're going to do this, which is of great advantage to us, and the fact that we've got this stream running through the property, well, it's not any worse than it was before, so we don't have to do anything. And that really has been insufficient to me. And I wondered what our power through statute or whatever would be to sort of say, no, you can't, if you're going to build onto your building 50%, no, you can't just let that little rivulet in the backyard be gross and green. Do we have any ability to do that?
Well, this stormwater quality manual does require you to meet the water quality volume for redevelopment sites. So it also requires you, though, if you do have like an expansion, you said 50%, you have to meet all the requirements for that additional 50% increase. So, and then you also have to prove, if you can't meet the requirements in this manual, you have to prove that you're meeting the requirements to the maximum extent practicable.
But is this just the 50% has to meet the requirements? So you have to just bring it up to what was there before?
Yes.
We can't, so it's unlike a lot of other zoning things where there's a trigger percentage where you can say if you're doing a 50% rehab, you now have to grandfather, you have to update everything. We can't do that?
Well, the different requirements, the criteria in Chapter 7, like your pre and post for your flow, you just have to meet your existing flow. So that 50% increase in flow would be what you have to meet for your pre and post. But under Chapter 7, like for your water quality volume, you have to treat all your impervious area for water quality, even your existing. So the different criterias have different requirements when it comes to redevelopment.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Before we continue, can I ask just more of a 1,000-foot question? As a non-technical, one of the non-technical person on I take for granted the 2002 CT erosion sediment control guidelines, as well as the 2004 CT DEP quality stormwater quality manual. Take for granted that 2002 was 20 years ago, and 2004 was 18 years ago. How often are these updated? And in this context, does that matter? Are there things that are sorely lacking from these current manuals and that you think are going to be coming, and if so, when? Like, when do we expect these to be updated?
So the 2002 with the sedimentation and erosion control, I mean, those requirements really haven't changed in a long time. And I don't know that they really have to be. The big piece that I think is lacking with many municipalities, maybe not with West Hartford, but many municipalities, is just the enforcement of those sedimentation and erosion controls on each construction site. And I don't see them really changing or improving or modifying that, because the sedimentation and erosion control over time doesn't really change.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, for me, it's like, to the extent that the town staff have confidence in these, and to the extent that I have confidence in town staff, I've always been pleased, you know, to hear that. But you know, it seems like this would be was the appropriate context to ask the question.
I mean,
I
some
appreciate
of the technologies have changed, where like it used to be like a lot of municipalities would do just silt fences and hay bales, when now they do more of those fiber rolls. So I mean, some of the technology has changed, but not necessarily your end result, where you want to not have discharges of sediment laden stormwater. So.
Thank you. That was helpful.
And then with respect to this 2004 Stormwater Quality Manual, there was an update in 2011, and it was with respect to the low impact development, because back in 2004, low impact development was really not considered industry standard, or kind of what engineers did on site development projects. So there was a low impact development amendment in 2011. And I anticipate there will be other updates to the stormwater quality manual, but it's not something that changes frequently, because I think, like, yes, you do have rainfall changes, and you do have changes due to climate and sea level rise and stuff, but the design of a facility, you know, it doesn't, you know, whether you're using a 10-year rainfall that, you know, was previously part of the rainfall data, or whether you're using the new Atlas 14 rainfall data, it's still a 10-year storm you're designing to, even though the new rainfall data is higher and the pipe will be bigger, you know. So that's kind of an example of, there's still a industry standard, it's just your data has changed. So. So there were two other things I wanted to kind of mention with this 2004 Stormwater Quality Manual. There's also an Appendix D, which provides a checklist for your stormwater applications. And so it does provide a very nice checklist that, you know, when an applicant submits their stormwater application, they should include, you know, and they have these check boxes. So this is a very good resource if you do not have, or you want to kind of check and improve your application checklist. And then the last thing they have, which is actually very helpful, for each VMP, they have either 1 or a 2-page kind of checklist that you can take into the field with you. And the one I put up here was for a stormwater pond or wetland, a stormwater created wetland. And so it does give you a list of things you should be looking at, and you can kind of check whether it's satisfactory, unsatisfactory, and put comments. And each of these is either like 1 or 2 pages for each BMP in this Appendix E. And it is a good guide if you're going out to inspect some kind of stormwater BMP that you're not familiar with, or that you don't really know what to look at. So I do just kind of refer to you to those when you're doing your site inspections. So the other thing I wanted to kind of show is just in the Connecticut DEP manual, they have really good guidance on, like this is in chapter 11 as well. And this is an example, if you're designing and you've selected to do a wet pond, it gives you an example and gives you some recommendations. Like if you see the cross section below, with respect to where elevation should be for your different requirements in the design criteria section 7 of the Connecticut DEP manual. So these are really good, and you can refer your contractors or your applicants to these if they, need guidance on how to design a particular BMP. So the other piece that is part of the requirements in minimum control measure 6 that we're in right now is this DCIA. So this is directly connected impervious area. So this is where you have impervious areas that are directly connected to each other, and they're directly connected to the drainage system. And so as part of the permit, they wanted you to do the town of West Hartford and every municipality that's under the MS4 permit to develop a baseline directly connected impervious area for your municipality. And so the town of West Hartford has done that. You guys are 14.4% of your townwide area is directly connected impervious area. And that equates to about 2,066 acres. The MS4 permit requires you to do a 2% reduction in this DCIA over the permit term, and then a 1% reduction for every year following the permit. And so that 2% reduction is 41 acres. The other piece of the permit that they do allow you to do is they do allow you to go back 5 years from the issuance of the permit. So 5 years prior to 2017, and you can take credit for any redevelopment sites that have either disconnected their impervious area, reduced their impervious area. You can take credit for that reduction as part of your 2% reduction starting 5 years prior to the issuance of the permit. So Dwayne and his engineering group is tracking these reductions and keeping track of this 2% reduction in the directly connected impervious area within the town. So I thought I'd pause here because I think this directly connected impervious area might be a new concept for many of you.
Could you give us an example, or could one of Todd or one of you guys give us an example of something in town?
Race Road.
Sorry, what?
So do you want me to just kind of give you an example of a directly connected impervious area?
Please.
Okay, so an example might be where there's a resident and their downspout from their roof goes directly to their driveway and then goes directly to the street, which connects to the drainage system. It could also be where your roof leader ties directly into a catch basin. So having that roof leader discharge instead to your front lawn, and it goes over a grassed area where it's allowed to infiltrate before it gets to the sidewalk and then to the drainage system, then that's not directly connected.
So herein lies the problem, the numbers and volume involved here. And I'm sure Gordon will pick up on this. So the calculation of our baseline, that's 3 square miles of the community that are essentially directly connected. So even to meet those threshold requirements, there's a lot of work and effort to try to reach those goals. So this is a challenging section of the permit, I would assume, that most municipalities struggle with.
Yes, most municipalities, one, they have a higher directly connected impervious area than you, but also they, many people have not done this tracking prior to the 2017 for the 5 years, and I do not know one municipality that I'm working with that is going to reach this 2% reduction. So, I mean, it really needs to be addressed or proven to DEP by June of this year. So, but I do know like people are working, municipalities are working on disconnecting, and a lot of them may be using, like, if you do roadway improvements and you're able to then have the water go into a stormwater BMP before it enters the catch basin, then that length of roadway then is not directly connected. It goes through a stormwater BMP. And when you do have redevelopment sites where they're addressing their water quality volume and their runoff is going into a stormwater BMP before it gets to your drainage system, then those redevelopment sites have a positive impact on this reduction. So you can incorporate those reductions in directly connected impervious area as well.
And Cindy, you had mentioned before, but it's worth noting, our last presenters in December had also mentioned an example whereby if a community, and some communities in the state are doing this, are redoing a roadway, for instance, and if the roadway was wider than needed to be, shrinking the paved surface area of the roadway is another way to help gear towards, you're reducing the impervious area of the roadway. So that's
Correct.
another way to tackle the number.
Yes.
I can just comment on that, Todd. That's a good point. And we've been taking credit where we can. This was my biggest concern with this permit when it came out with respect to West Hartford. This is our greatest challenge. We're not going to make the requirement for the 5th year, but we've done what we can to report what we can, and we're going to continue to look for solutions. So we have narrowed a lot of roads, both for traffic calming and environmental improvements, and we've taken credit for those over the past 5 years, as well as any redevelopments that apply. We are looking to use low impact development and other means to get closer to this goal. An example of that, if you look at the center of West Hartford, there's a lot of impervious, and we're kind of paying for the sins of our past, if you will, with respect to not controlling that runoff before it reaches the drainage system. The town is looking at doing a project in the center where we can sort of rejuvenate or reconstruct LaSalle Road and Farmington Avenue. We have a lot of nice street trees there that are getting to the tail end, if not at the tail end of their life. So one thought is, could we have rain gardens along the edge of the road where the runoff would go into a landscape area to provide irrigation to trees or other landscaping? So those are the types of treatments that we're looking to do wherever we can to get closer to this goal. Thank you.
So just a quick follow-up question on that. It sounds like the funding for this is either the town's money or where you can persuading redevelopment to exceed their requirements for quality. That's about it, huh?
Yes. Or just meet their water quality volume. So.
Okay. And then I know you guys are, I should say, what I seem to see is that you guys are really aggressive and successful, and I mean that in the most positive sense with regards to obtaining grants and so on and so forth from the state and other places. And I'd imagine that's another area that you guys are at. This is an area where you're active. If there's opportunities, you're looking for them and seeking them. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Most of the grants and opportunities, though, are not, well, I should say, majority of them are more for like stormwater flooding and capacity. It's hard to get a water quality grant unless it's like you can get them as part of like a FH, a highway or a roadway, if you've got water quality components, but it's hard to get a specific, like just water quality grant.
That's interesting. I just know that Dwayne, Todd, and everybody are really active where they can. I didn't know about this specific part. That's an interesting data point, Cindy. Thank you.
Yeah, but you have been very aggressive with the stormwater quantity aspect, especially along Trout Brook, where another consultant had done a report to upsize some culverts. You've been very aggressive with trying to get a grant for those 4 or 5 culvert replacements. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I do have a little bit more on this minimum control measure, and it's mostly with respect to low impact development. And so I do have an example here of implementation of low impact development in a redevelopment site. So this is the Capitol in Hartford, the Capitol property. And we were fortunate enough, CDM Smith was fortunate enough to work with the city of Hartford at the Capitol and implement, I want to say it was like 6 or 7 years ago, we implemented stormwater BMPs, best management practices at the Capitol, to improve water quality. And it's also a really nice pilot place where you can actually go, and they have a pamphlet, and you can walk around the site and you can see these low impact development BMPs in place, and they were all retrofits. And so we constructed 3 rain gardens at the main entrance there, 2 on either side, and then a little ways up. We also did permeable pavers at the crosswalks and also in like an island. And then we also did a green roof. So just to the left of the main entrance, there is a roof that's actually at ground level. So there's a basement that has a roof that's at ground level, and we actually installed a green roof there. So you can just walk right there, get out of your car, and it's right there, the green roof. And then we also installed Pervious Pavement. And that's the pink area around the site, both in parking areas and sidewalks. And then we actually put in a rain harvesting where it captures roof runoff and puts it in a cistern, and then that water is used for irrigation. So I do have some photos of these. So on the left, there are 2 rain gardens. These were retrofit projects where we took a corner and we cut into the curb and allowed the stormwater to go into these rain gardens and provide water quality treatment prior to entering the drainage systems. And in all 3 of them, we actually just had a drainage, like a catch basin, and we were able to just raise that a little so that there's a little bit of storage prior to entering the drainage system. And then we did install pervious pavement, and that upper right is where I've actually been there and I've done this, is I pour a water bottle onto the sidewalk and it all just infiltrates. And then we've installed permeable pavers across at the crosswalks. And then the bottom right is a picture of that green roof just to the left of the entrance. I think that's the end of, yep. So that's the end of my minimum control measure 5, which is your site development requirements.
I never knew. So that area in front of where the constitutional officers park, that's a green roof?
Yes.
Yeah,
So there's building underneath that? There's occupiable space underneath it?
Yes.
I'll be damned, I walked by there a million times.
part of the press area
Wow,
and under housing, old housing.
I didn't know that.
I do have a question about the pervious pavement.
Mhm.
It's, in some areas, it's in great shape, and they've done it out at Whole Foods in Avon, and I'm very curious to watch that. In some areas, with talking with legislative management, they've had real problems with frost heave and it breaking apart and disintegrating in spots. Now, and you were saying 6 or 7 years ago, this was done a lot longer ago, I think, than that.
Okay.
And I'm not
I might
sure,
be off. I don't know the date. I don't remember, but I do know it was a while ago.
but I'm not sure, you know, and I think the field may have progressed since then. But how realistic is pervious pavement in residential settings? I'm going to assume we can't do Main Street in it, but how long lasting is it, and comparatively, how expensive is it?
So
You know?
the cost has actually come closer to regular pavement. And I know there's a few things to consider. One is like the installation of it. And we had the problem here at the Capitals. You really have to find a contractor because it's a little different with the installation, and you have to make sure your installation is correct or you don't get the longevity of the BMP. The thing I have realized though is with your pervious pavement or your porous asphalt, it has a lot to do with having sun in the winter months. So like a lot of times it's not in like a downtown area, it's not applicable on one side of the street because that side of the street never gets sun in the winter. So you really have to, and I've learned this over the years, you really have to place it based on an area that will get sun in the winter. So
Interesting.
yeah, I mean,
And
most literature
maintenance
doesn't
is
really tell you that, but that's what I've found is that the placement of it has a lot to do with the building shadows, you know.
interesting, and maintenance is a big issue as well. Is that right?
And not so much if you don't sand your sidewalks, if you just shovel them and the sun can melt it, then your maintenance is kind of minimal. But if you have to apply sand, and that's where if it doesn't get the sun, you know, and it shouldn't ice up. And if you, I mean, if you have the sun and you don't have like downspouts going across the sidewalk, or, you know, that it shouldn't, you know, when ice melts or the snow melts, like once it gets to the pavement, it infiltrates. So you don't typically have the ice problems you do have with normal traditional pavement. So
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in that. And yeah, the green roof is just like succulent city over there at the Capitol.
yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. So now I do have, so minimum control measure 6 is your pollution prevention and good housekeeping. And so this one does have a large list. So this minimum control measure has 11 requirements as part of the Connecticut DEP permits. A majority of these BMPs are the responsibility more of your like DPW and highway. So it includes employee training. It includes operation and maintenance of your MS4 facilities, so the facilities that are owned by the town, and implementation of coordination with other MS4s. So you do have other MS4s that are adjacent to you, so it's the abutting municipalities. And then you also have like private connections are an interconnection that's not yours. And then also the state roadways where their drainage connects to yours, that is an interconnection. So other MS4s, they're listed as like an interconnection to your MS4, and you need to coordinate with them. And then development of a source control program with respect to pollutants of concern, evaluating your measures that discharge to impaired waters, and then tracking that DCIA, which we talked about previously, and the ability for you to disconnect that directly connected impervious area. Development and implementation of an infrastructure repair program, and then development and implementation of retrofit projects for stormwater. And then the last 3 are all maintenance requirements, including your street sweeping, your catch basin cleaning, and your snow management practices. So I don't think I'm not going into a lot of these in detail because a lot of them are straightforward, but just kind of with respect to good housekeeping and what you can do is just maintain regular sweeping and cleanup activities, and also pick up and dispose of materials and waste materials and garbage correctly. And then if there is a spill, regardless of what it is, just promptly clean it up and prevent the pollution from entering the drainage system. So the last one, which is, so there's 6 minimum control measures, and then they added this wet weather monitoring. So this one is kind of weird because it's just called an S instead of a BMP, you know, minimum control measure 1-1 or minimum control measure 2-1. It's called S, and I don't know why, but that's Connecticut DEP. So the wet weather monitoring has these BMPs S1 through S4. And so what's required in the permit is you actually have to go out during a wet weather event, and you have to do outfall screening. You have to do an inventory and mapping of all the discharges, so the outfalls that discharge to impaired waters. And I will show you a map in a minute that has the impaired waters in the town of West Hartford. And then there are follow-up investigations based on that wet weather screening. And then there's annual monitoring of the top 6 priority outfalls. So outfall sampling is wet weather inspections of all of your outfalls. And there are requirements for the qualifying rain event with respect to antecedent conditions and then the amount of rainfall. And so, and then also qualifying with respect to the lab and when they can receive your samples. But you are testing for temperature, pH, and conductivity using a meter. And then typically you send ammonia, surfactants, chlorine, and bacteria to the lab. And then if you do have impaired water that's impaired for something other than ammonia, surfactants, chlorine, and bacteria, then you would also sample for that pollutant of concern as well. So on the figure on the right, the streams that are in yellow, those are your impaired streams in the town of West Hartford. And then the outfalls are shown in different colors. The green outfalls are either state or private, so they are not the responsibility of the town of West Hartford to sample during wet weather events. And this was through, this map is from 2019, and we have continued wet weather sampling every spring. So the permit also requires you to perform wet weather sampling between March 1st and June 30th. So every spring, we have worked with Dwayne and we've conducted wet weather sampling of your outfalls, and it's very problematic and challenging because Mother Nature does not always want to rain when you want it to rain. So every year is different. But we have sampled quite a few of your outfalls, and we're not done with the sampling, the wet weather sampling yet. But we have been making progress every year, sampling as many outfalls as we can in each of that March through June. And so this is an ongoing thing. Once we've sampled all of your outfalls, then you're only required to do those annual top 6. So the outfalls with the highest pollutants result from your ammonia, surfactants, chlorine, and bacteria, those 4. So the ones with the highest exceedances would then be the top 6 that you would do annually after you've done all of your outfalls. And so I guess I will stop for a minute to see if you have any questions on the wet weather sampling. Okay, so then just my final few slides is just I wanted to kind of give you a little guidance on what the town planning and zoning and the IWWA can do with respect to the MS4 permit requirements. And so as I forget who had mentioned, I think it was maybe Todd that had mentioned that, you know, minimum control measure 4 and minimum control measure 5 are kind of the most important for the TP&Z and the IWWA with respect to your sedimentation and erosion control requirements and your post-construction site development requirements with respect to stormwater. And so those are the 2 I think you have the most you contribute most to conforming to what the permit requirements are for those 2 minimum control measures. And then I just wanted to highlight that minimum control measure 3, that illicit discharge detection and elimination. At the end of each presentation, I tell town employees and town board members and volunteers that it's really kind of everyone's job to kind of keep an eye out for these illicit connections, because they typically are not occurring all the time. They're kind of intermittent, and you are the eyes of the town. And so when you're out there, and if you see, you know, whether it's you see someone dumping oil into a catch basin, you know, you can go out and you can educate that person. Or if you see, you know, suds in a catch basin, then you can let Dwayne know and they can follow up. So I think the IDDE is a big thing where it's something that everyone can work on. So I do have a slide on that. So what you can do is to report those illicit discharges, talk to the residents, not only about IDD, but all the MS4 requirements, participate in the MS4 program, and then just educate your peers. So that is the end of my presentation, and I did put our contacts up here. You know, if you have any questions, you can reach out to Dwayne or Todd, or you can also reach out to me. And then also there is the website that is the stormwater management website that has a lot of this information. And then I believe it will also have this presentation on it as well.
Thank you, Cindy. Do we have any questions before we move over to TOD?
Oh, just thank you, Cindy. That was very informative.
That was really good.
You're
If I could,
welcome.
one other comment, just for the record, the town has a report a problem app, and also it's available to residents on our web pages, and it can be used for anything, potholes, street light being out, but it also has items in it for MS4. You know, if you see an illicit discharge, for example, you can use that app to put that information in to get the town to investigate it. So I just wanted to mention there's that feature for residents to use as well. Thank you.
Is this presentation going to be up on the Town of West Hartford site?
Liz, it will. We'll put it on the website, and maybe I can work with Dwayne on putting in the stormwater management subpage in the engineering folder. We'll also print off a copy of the presentation and distribute it like we did last time. You should have all received the 2 printed copies of the presentation from our December. Great. So we'll have that as well. And for next steps on stormwater LID, I'd like to keep the momentum going forward if we could. Keep the water flowing downstream. Terrible engineering joke, but I'd like to suggest that we take a stab at looking at what we heard last time. There was a line-by-line review code ordinance worksheet provided by the NEMO folks, and take a look at both our subdivision regulations and our zoning regulations for LID best practices. Apply that as a benchmark, and then take the 2011 stormwater control LID section and explore that with the TPZ a little bit more thoroughly, so we can get an idea of where we are and where that manual says and where we might want to go as kind of our next steps in this discussion. And just wanted some feedback on that approach.
And Todd, as far as a vehicle for that discussion, how do you think the next discussion of that, where should that be placed? Where is that best had?
So we have 2 options. Obviously, if we have a lighter agenda, we can have a carved out part on the agenda if I know there's going to be a light regular meeting agenda, or we could carve out some time for a special meeting once we're prepared and have done the analysis of the regulations involved. Completely up to your preference as a mission and agency, given your time volunteering here.
Well, I only insofar as I want, because this has been a really valuable discussion, and I want to make sure the momentum that is built by this discussion continue. So only insofar as you guys need time to give us something complete. But is there, I don't want to say a date certain, but is there a range certain in which we could expect to see that?
I think we could be prepared to present something early beginning of March. Need a little bit more time because it's a little bit more labor intensive on our part to go through and formulate the discussion. So I think that'd be reasonable. And if we could carve out time ahead of time, figure out your availabilities, we could certainly do it in a special meeting.
All right. So I think and I sort of call on my fellow members to make sure that we all remember to ask as we get closer to that date. And obviously, insofar as you guys have so many things to do, and frankly, this presentation makes me realize how much more is happening behind the scenes that we don't even see. But if we will check in with you, and if you need more time, just let us know. But we want to make sure that we're dialed into it and hearing it. If it's not, if it can't be March, that's fine. But that's a good one to shoot for. So let's look at March. So I don't want to cut anybody off, but are we ready to move on to TOD?
Thank you, Cindy and Dwayne, and the rest
Thank you,
of the
Cindy.
engineering
Thank you,
division.
everybody.
Thank you very much. Reach out to me if you have other questions.
This has been wonderful. Thank you
Yeah.
very
Yeah,
much.
thanks, Cindy. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time, Dwayne.
So, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I can take us into that next item on the agenda, and that's a discussion on TOD. I'll share my screen, which is essentially the content presentation that I provided you all with earlier. And what we're looking at here is a summary report from our TOD initiative. And if you'll recall, going back last spring and summer, we began public outreach around a TOD zoning initiative that was focused on our 2 fast track station areas, and we applied a 1/4 mile buffer as in a kind of a 5-minute walk shed around either station area, and wanted to better understand community and property owner preference and perception about future development and growth, vis-a-vis some specific changes to our zoning ordinances. And we did an engagement process that involved a couple of public meetings as identified in the report, virtual public meetings with both the business associations and the community at large. And we conducted an online visual preference survey, which was very informative. Some of the critical takeaways from those responses were that there wasn't a high frequency of usage of respondents who actually used it or visit the station areas, but a lot of folks that participated in our survey and our process did visit the area on a regular basis for shopping or food services. The vast majority of respondents currently access those station areas vis-a-vis car, 8% on foot, and the rest, the smaller percentage, via bicycle. And what we did that we haven't done in the past, what was very informative, particularly in the context of looking at developing new zoning, was to create a visual preference survey. So you'll recall I sent out everyone on the commission and encouraged you all to participate in that process. And we provided some illustrative examples of design types or images that infer design-based concepts, such as what kind of preference do you envision in the flatbed station area in terms of story height? Do you like parking behind the buildings, right up to the buildings, on the side of the buildings? These type of questions. And we broke out both Flatbush and the Elmwood station area separately, because we wanted to also understand, does the community or do residents have a perception that these areas are distinctly different station areas, or should we treat them the same? There might have been a preference. So with respect to this Flatbush station area, about 60% did not find it visually attractive today. Most, about 57%, found 3 to 4 story buildings were appropriate, with 21% up to 5 stories were appropriate. And about 67% felt that the 616 New Park was the right density. And that was one of the images we provided, with some kind of street placement of buildings up on the street with a small landscape buffer. And then the vast majority of everyone thought or wanted parking to the rear of buildings. What we saw in the Elmwood station area was virtually identical response rate and preferences of moderate height buildings, 3 up to 5 stories in some instances, with a moderate density around the kind of the 616 development type, parking in the rear. So what we were able to determine that there wasn't a distinct preference or construct of different treatment for either station area. We largely heard the same thing from the focus groups in the community forum, that there was really a strong preference for development and continued dialogue to develop a sense of community building around these station areas. And when thinking about that, most participants were envisioning improved streetscape, more green space, and infill development with a greater mix of land uses. And particularly, there was a lot of commentary and notation that there was a lot of fields of overdeveloped or underutilized parking, depending on how you're looking at it. So that could present great opportunities for infill development in parking lots to have something that better activates the street and creates a more walkable, pedestrian-friendly environment within the corridor. There was also a very strong preference by both business associations and the community that it's very important that we need to retain and keep existing businesses and provide a more flexible place for them to grow within that area, but also provide for new uses to be attracted there, including residential. And so those are kind of the key findings of the takeaway. Just making sure everyone saw that. There's a switch. There's a snake-like timeline on your screen now. Yes, great. Just as a reminder, and you perhaps, aside from the council, are very familiar with the town's past efforts, but this is an ongoing dialogue and discussion that we've had that really goes back, I would argue, to 2013, when the fast track stations were in the planning phases and under construction. But going back to 2015, the town became more actively engaged with both the DOT and also CROG by participating in some planning studies And again, in 2016, around the rail station. Recall that the Flatbush Fast Track Station has been identified for a future but unfunded rail station. So that station, if you could envision it, the Fast Track Station, the bus side is on New Park. On the other side, of the train tracks, but immediately adjacent to there could be a future rail station should the funding be identified. So that would create a pretty unique, what we call multimodal transit node, where you could get off one form of public transit, be it train or bus, and switch to another mode and continue on your journey. As a result of those efforts and participation with both the state and CROG, we were able to secure grant funding and complete the New Park Avenue Transit Complete Street Study. That study focused principally on infrastructure improvements within the New Park corridor to make it more pedestrian friendly and have a better streetscape environment. At the tail end of the study, we also identified the need to revisit our zoning ordinances and take a stronger look at ways to find a mechanism to make them more transit supportive. We were then able to kind of segue that and parlay those efforts into securing over several $1 million of grants to actually build the streetscape improvements, which are currently under design, and we hope to go out into construction in the coming years. We also participated in the interim in a separate DOT-led train line action plan. And then the work and effort that TPZ put into the POCD, there was clearly an emphasis and a focus on our TOD past work and then the continued work, principally identifying the need to revisit zoning ordinances around a more supportive TOD focus, which led us into this TOD process that we started last April. So all of that to say, we have created a draft ordinance. We shared it with the council and the business association in the past month and a half, and we'd like to do more outreach. Here, our next stop in that outreach effort, whereby I would like to, after this meeting, share that ordinance with you and then put this on our February agenda to get additional feedback on the construct of the ordinance. And what it attempts to do is focus all the feedback we heard today on what our POCD suggests and create a new tool that may be and likely would be a new rezoning around the station areas that creates a more transit-oriented district. I don't know what the acronym that we come up with is, but it would focus on more design focus first, meaning that we're going to try to encourage placement of buildings, preserve mixes of uses. There might be some uses that are deemed to be incompatible with TOD, and then provide some other incentives, slight increases in density in terms of residential units per square foot, slight increases in FAR, and then create a menu of bonusable standards. And that's something that's unique that we don't have currently. And that menu is a series of incentives. If a developer wants to build a little bit more units per acre or a little bit less parking, or provide for maybe a little bit more FAR, they could choose from a series of incentives that are encouraged by either the POCD or the feedback we heard. And some of those would be to create or facilitate access and linkage to public open space, linkages to the Troutbrook Trail, to encourage or incorporate green infrastructure, LID requirements within proactively into their designs, or to include deed restricted affordable housing units at higher rates. So things that we know are important in POCD and also that we heard from the community, trying to incentivize through increased allowances in the zoning. So I wanted to just kind of remind everyone where we were and then pause there. And I'm happy to answer any questions, but just make you aware that between now and our February meeting, it was my hope to send you out a draft for your comment and feedback so you have time to digest.
Todd, I worked long and hard on the TND in Elmwood Center. And the criticism is absolutely right that the enforceability of that is what's lacking. It's all hinged on whether you redevelop 40% or 41. And it really has had very little impact and should have had more. So I do want to see some more aggressive work in terms of this. And I'm very in favor. I mean, I think we all have kind of the same idea of what we want to see there. I don't think that's really in conflict. Could I also suggest, though, in terms of the transit-oriented development, well, yeah, it's great to have places that cars go and park and businesses at train stations. In between Cole and New Britain Avenue, there's no way to cross the street. Which, you know, if you live in that great big beautiful apartment building and you want to go have a donut at Hartford Bakery, you can't. So Hartford Bakery isn't there anymore. So that is something I don't see anybody really addressing, but there's no way to get across the street for very long stretches.
So, Commissioner Gillette, part of the New Park Avenue Complete Street Study is a road diet. So it's taking the 4 lanes of traffic, which are largely not needed based on volumes, and moving that down to 3 with the potential for a center left, twin left center turn lane. Also, perhaps some areas to introduce landscape features and islands, and then add in areas where appropriate additional crossings or enhance the crossings where they belong. Your comment was echoed and heard loudly by from the Elmwood Business Association on the perceived failings of the T&D zone. And one of my observations of that zoning requirement, welcome Commissioner Gomes' feedback, is that it's an overlay zone. So it's only triggered when you meet a certain threshold amount where that zone then gets landed and becomes applicable to the zone below. And the tool that was developed was a 50% of improvement of the assessed value. So you're right in that it never really had the desired effect, because there also wasn't a clawback or a look back provision where someone couldn't then incrementally improve a property, one application of 10% and then another application 10%, and have that incremental change without it. Basically, you could avoid it. So the approach we're taking is to not even do an overlay zone and suggesting a straight rezoning, which would become effective, upon the rezoning. The trick there is, how can we create enough, and this is the part that I'm having the most struggle with, is how do we create a flexible enough zoning tool that still achieves those development outcomes to have a more consistent pedestrian friendly mixed use environment, but allow the existing properties that might become non-conforming a clear path to incrementally become more conforming throughout the years without triggering the needs of the ZBA's involvement on every kind of small application. That's the trick and the approach we're looking towards.
I think we think in terms of pedestrian friendly, and it kind of goes back to our mindset of that means street side retail where people shop. And it may not be that that's what it is. What it is residential above, business below, and I'm going to go see my architect, and then I'm going to go across to the coffee shop, and I'm picking up things at the dry cleaners. It's not shopping in sort of traditional retail that I think a lot of us sort of might be in the back of our minds, so much as it's neighborhood usage to encourage spaces where you can have perhaps a coffee shop or a dry cleaner. You can have things you use, a drugstore. And anyway, I'll be quiet. It's just PMD was my life's blood, and I'm glad to see you're doing a zone change.
It's one of the things you mentioned, Liz, is it's also important, I think, to create a more consistent built environment. So having a better defined landscape requirements, maybe there isn't a mix of uses on every property, and that's okay. but having buildings that are at least built closer up to the street line that provide for opportunity of a sense of enclosure that makes it feel more comfortable as a pedestrian, having some landscape requirements along the front of a property. And one of the things I glossed over that I shouldn't have, and your comment just reminded me, is we wrote in a provision to incentivize or bonus curb cut consolidation and management. So the more curb cuts we have along a property frontage, the more friction of vehicles, pedestrians, and the less walkable or friendly that environment is. And if you go up and down the corridor today, there's many properties that have many curb cuts. So figuring out ways to incentivize that kind of a consolidation will have a dramatic impact on the look and feel of that environment.
Well, and where you find out where those curb cuts are, there may be opportunities for traffic lights and crosswalks that are centralized and sensible and allow people to cross as well as cars.
Hey, Todd, want to take?
Sorry, Kev, you go.
Sure. Todd, when I take a look at this, I'm just want to make sure I'm properly framed. I'm going to be looking at the POCD. I'm going to be bouncing off that. Is there any other, documents past, things that we've done, activities, resources that might not be bad to have at hand or reflect on in advance? And then part two of the question to you is there any particular areas that you'd like us, me in particular, to pay attention to?
I don't think so. It's a fairly straightforward ordinance, but I do
Okay.
think your first question is a good one. There is some of those past studies that are worth including aside from the POCD that can help frame that idea.
If there's any, if I can ask, I'm sorry, Andrea, if I can ask if when you pass this out, would you consider putting links into the email?
I will do that. Absolutely. I'll include them as a direct link. And then also we could actually print off the pertinent pieces of reports that I think are good reference material.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, but to Mr. Dumais, I would also suggest including, to the extent we are examining or town staff is examining other TOD regulations in other municipalities, even if it's outside of the state, similar to what we did for the POCD. It's nice to be able to look at what works in other municipalities, other cities. And, I'm using the phrase cherry pick in a positive way as opposed to what it's normally implies, but I think that could be helpful. So we understand what works in other municipalities and, collectively our minds put together, we may have some good ideas to the extent we see any holes in the existing regulation or any problems that we need to solve. And Todd, I agree. The overlay zone is difficult because you get the applications that are great. We'll find out what the fair market value is, and we will improve to 49% of it. So rezoning is the way to go.
Any other questions or comments on this? So Todd, swinging back around, same question. What's our next step? What's our next discussion?
So your next step discussion is I'll have a draft of some of those different elements and reference materials for you to look at. We can talk about at our next meeting in February.
Okay, thank you.
And that's all I had on the agenda, Mr. Chairman, for this evening. So if there aren't any other questions, I just wanted to thank you all for your extra time. These special meetings, I know they're tough on your schedules, but I really appreciate the guidance and the feedback you provide. It's invaluable for us to hear as we move these initiatives that you've largely had a huge role in forward.
And I just really appreciate all you have done to put forward these meetings, to give us this information, and that it's online and people can see it. I think this is very, very valuable, and may spark, hopefully, although people don't really advertise stormwater management, TP&Z meetings, It
Yeah,
might.
I can say, I was an alternate. I joined as an alternate after the last POCD was passed, within about a year or so, and we were not having these discussions. It was like they all got to the finish line, they signed the POCD, and then it was like never spoken of again. And so this is a massive
This is.
forward.
And I'd like the opportunity for the public to be able to see it and for people who are very interested to become involved and to become better informed and to know that things don't just happen out of nowhere, including for us. So I fully appreciate this.
And I'd say it's a gross overstatement to give us that much credit. Really appreciate everything, Todd, you, Brian, everybody else. I mean, Brian, for years, watching what's going on in the town, knowing what people are actually doing, how folks are behaving, using the resources. Dwayne there, same thing, years with his staff, Julie, et cetera. I appreciate the credit, at least to me, but it's well overstated. Thanks for letting us take a peek and looking forward to trying to provide some cross-reference to the POCD, so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. If there's not anything further, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right. Let me try your minds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Night,
you.
everybody.
Weeks.
Have a great week, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.